Hey everyone, I just spent the last couple of months reading through every book in the Grishaverse by leighbardugo, and to celebrate I thought I'd put all the reviews together into one handy video. But as always, since I don't feel like outright recycling content, I've gone and reviewed almost every short story in the setting, too. The only ones I'm skipping are the shorts in the Lives of Saints. There's just not enough content in each of them to review individually. I've learned my lesson from trying to do that with Halo, which I will get back to eventually. Reviews are going to be in chronological order to the best of my ability. There's going to be a full ranking at the end of the video. Let's get to it. Hey everyone, I just read The Demon in the Woods, the text version rather than the graphic novel, and meh. Wow, a story about the Darkling. Excuse me while I go take a nap. It's a short story about the Darkling back when he was a kid living under the alias of Eric, and the events that set him on the path to becoming the character he is at the beginning of the Shadow and Bone trilogy. The pros? I suppose it's interesting to see the Darkling as a kid without all the baggage that he has in the main books, and it was cool to see his mother during this period too, so there's that. It had an interesting hook with the first scene being set at the end of the tale, and then the rest of the story was a recount of how we got here. In terms of structure, it was solid, and it had a satisfying ending, given it ended with just about everyone dead. The cons? The Darkling just isn't a compelling character. He's incredibly boring, and that's no different here in my opinion. I just found there was nothing here to be invested in, when I already know he's going to survive, and it didn't really tell me anything about his character either. The twist toward the end of this story was just so obvious. It didn't feel forced, but it did feel purpose-made to make Eric sympathetic by comparison. But again, I already know where his character is headed as the Darkling, who I find to be wholly unsympathetic, so it just falls flat. And it doesn't actually add anything to the series. It explains a little about the Darkling's motivations, but those were made clear in the main books anyway. Overall, it just felt unnecessary. Yeah, I didn't enjoy this one at all. Maybe you'll get something out of it if you're a huge fan of the Shadow and Bone trilogy specifically, but otherwise I think you can give it a pass. Maybe the graphic novel version is better, I don't know, I haven't read it. And I'm giving The Demon in the Woods a D, sorry. Hey everyone, I just read Ayama and the Thornwood, the first story collected in the Language of Thorns, and it was actually pretty good. This setting lends itself really well to these sorts of old-fashioned fairy tales. It's a short story about the son of a king and queen who is a bit of a beast, and the daughter of a pair of peasants who also happens to be a little odd, and how their worlds collide when the latter is tasked with going out into the woods to slay the former. The pros? It's such a small thing, but I really liked how Ayama and her conventionally beautiful sister really love each other, that there's no stereotypical rivalry between them. I'm so used to every woman in fiction hating every other woman in fiction, so it was refreshing to have these two just liking each other despite their circumstances. I also really enjoyed the structure of this story, how Ayama tells the beast three very stereotypical fairy tales, but then puts a spin on each one when he calls her out on how rote they are. It was a nice way to not only express their characters through the telling of the story, but also a sweet way to build up their relationship. And I also really liked how the beast's brother, the prince, just seemed like a genuinely nice guy. It was also a breath of fresh air after so many of the princes in this series turning out to be absolute scumbags. The cons? The stories Ayama tells the beast are pretty forgettable, perhaps by design. They worked well as a plot device, but in and of themselves, they weren't too interesting. The story is resolved very easily and very neatly in the end, which isn't too surprising given how most fairy tales go, but it felt a bit abrupt considering how much of a slow burn the story was otherwise. And like with so many short stories, it didn't really grab me. It took a little while to really get going, but whatever, it's a nitpick. As far as short stories go, I thought this one was actually pretty good. I enjoyed it more than I was expecting. If you're a fan of dark fairy tales, I think you could definitely do worse, and I'd easily recommend it if you want more of this setting, and I'm giving Ayama and the Thornwood a high B. Hey everyone, I just read The Too Clever Fox, the second story collected in the Language of Thorns, and it was fun. Who knew in-universe fairy tales could be so engaging? It's a short story about a fox who was too clever for his own good, and the dire situations he often finds himself having to talk his way out of. The pros? I really loved how this was just a classic fable in every way. The plot, the animal protagonists, the setting, everything. It may not have a lesson to impart like a lot of fables do, other than don't fall for your own legend, I guess, but it still scratched that itch in a very satisfying way. I really enjoyed how the story included familiar locations from other Grishaverse books like the Little Palace in Ravka, it creates such a strong connection to the setting and feels very authentic to the kind of tale that it is. And I loved the twist. It actually caught me off guard, it was really well executed. The cons? The fox is annoying. There, I said it. I know that's the point, I know that's his character, but that doesn't make him any less annoying. Like with Ayama and the Thornwood, I felt the story was resolved just a little too abruptly for how well it was otherwise structured. I would have liked just a little bit more of a denouement. And it's a short story, so you know it just did not grab me at the beginning. It's fine. I enjoyed it for the most part, if only because it's so unlike most short stories I have to read for the various series that I've covered. I'd recommend it if you're in the mood for a grim fable or just want more of the Grishaverse, and I'm giving The Too Clever Fox a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Witch of Duva, the third story collected in the Language of Thorns, and what can I say? It's another banger. The Grishaverse has never been this disturbing, goodness me. It's a short story about a young woman who suspects a local baker of being behind the disappearances of several local girls, and things take a turn when the baker marries her father. The pros? There is a part of this story that was viscerally disgusting in the absolute best way. I really enjoyed how this tale treated a couple of standard fairy tale tropes with gruesome realism. In addition to that, I really enjoyed the subversions and twists this story took with standard fairy tale tropes, like the wicked stepmother and the evil witch. It did a great job of turning Hansel and Gretel on its head, and I really enjoyed the characters in this one. They didn't always make the smartest or nicest decisions, but their motivations were all clear, and I understood what each of them wanted by the tale's end. The cons? Much as I enjoyed the resolution to the mystery behind the missing women, it does come a little out of nowhere, which I guess is to be expected in a short story, but I would have liked a little more foreshadowing regarding that particular twist. I do think the story meanders a bit. I understand it would have felt a little empty if it just went straight from plot point to plot point, but I didn't find everything that happened in between the big moments all that interesting either. And it doesn't really fit with the folklore and mythology built across the rest of the Grishaverse. It feels much more at home in our world than that one, but whatever, that's a nitpick. This is another fun story, I quite enjoyed it, and I'd recommend it if you're looking for a modern take on a classic fairy tale or just want more of this series, and I'm giving The Witch of Duva an A. Yeah, it was that good. Hey everyone, I just read Little Knife, the fourth story collected in the Language of Thorns, and it was fun. We need more sentient bodies of water in fiction. It's a short story about a duke's beautiful daughter, the tasks he sets her suitors in order to win her hand in marriage, and the down on his luck Grisha Tidemaker willing to do whatever it takes in order to beat out his competitors. The pros? As with so many of these stories, I love how it takes stock fairy tale tropes and twists them into something fun and new. I'm so sick of the damsel in distress trope, or women being used as a prize to be won or rescued by male leads, so it was great to have the story treat the suitors as the desperate losers that they are, and make it so that the Duke's daughter ends up with someone who is actually pretty cool. I also really enjoyed how this tale was structured, at first presenting the Grisha Tidemaker as the protagonist after the Duke puts down his ultimatum, but eventually switching things around to reveal the true lead of the story. It was a slow burn, but it worked really well, and I just really liked Little Knife. You can't go wrong with a sentient river. The cons? I understand this is meant to be a riff on an old fairy tale, but I still found it a little weird that so many adult men were trying to get with the Duke's teenage daughter. It just kept giving me horrible flashbacks to Alina and Mr. Sunset from the Shadow and Bone trilogy. Much as I enjoyed the structure, the river suddenly becoming a character toward the end of the story did feel a little jarring, given so much of the tale up to that point had been told from the perspective of the Tidemaker. And the story does end very abruptly, but as usual, that's a nitpick. I can't believe this is the series that is knocking the short stories out of the park, but here we are. Once again, I'd easily recommend it, and I'm giving Little Knife an A. Hey everyone, I just read The Soldier Prince, the fifth story collected in the Language of Thorns, and this one was a bit of a slump, honestly. Guess we can't win them all. It's a short story about a clockmaker who builds a toy soldier for nefarious purposes, but the soldier has other plans of his own. The pros? I liked the lead characters in this one. Most of the shorts in this collection feature young women as protagonists, so it was nice to have the toy soldier as a little garnish of variety, especially given he was genuinely heroic, rather than a bit of a scumbag like the Tidemaker from Little Knife. On that note, the Rat King was a great character, not just a subversion of the original portrayal in the Nutcracker, but just a fun guy to be around, and I liked the denouement. It took its time to bring the story down to a close, and it all dovetailed very nicely. It was really good. The cons? Like with a couple of other stories in this collection, it feels more like it belongs at home in our world than it does in the Grishaverse, but that's just a nitpick. I didn't find the conflict that interesting. I've never really cared about the Nutcracker story, so whatever subversive elements it adds to that tale were lost on me. Other rather than the Rat King. It's just not for me. And there just wasn't much of a hook to this one. The setup is very similar to Little Knife, and putting this story right after that one just made it feel a little repetitive overall. It's fine, but I found it to be a bit boring overall. If you're reading it in the Language of Thorns, or are looking for another twisted fairy tale, by all means give it a read. Otherwise, I think you can give it a miss. And I'm giving The Soldier Prince a C. Hey everyone, I just read When Water Sang Fire, the 6th and final story collected in the Language of Thorns, and it was kind of mid, honestly. Like I say in the review of the Language of Thorns overall, it just feels like a take on Disney's Frozen. It's a short story about a young Sidraher, a mermaid in essence, who, along with her friend, is brought onto land by her prince in order to secure a gift great enough to guarantee that prince the throne upon their return to the water. But all is not as it seems. The pros? There were some great and gruesome fantasy concepts in this story, such as how the Sidraher have to cut their tails in half in order to form legs, or the mirror intended to preserve the soul of the human king so that he might live on and rule forever. It was all really creative and really well integrated into the story. I also really loved how destructive the ending of this one was, even if it was still pretty bleak, and I liked how it tried to put a spin on the Little Mermaid, even if I feel like it mostly didn't succeed. The cons? I did not like the lead in this one. Maybe she's meant to come off as naive, but so many of the twists felt so obvious to me that her not seeing them coming just made her come off as an idiot. Speaking of which, the twists here felt like they were here for the sake of being subversive rather than because they were right for the story. Like I mentioned, it felt a bit like Frozen, where one of the characters just decides they're now the villain halfway through. And it's just so bleak, which I understand The Little Mermaid is meant to be, at least as far as Hans Christian Andersen wrote it, but there's just no levity here, and it feels like such a sour note to end on. It's not terrible, but I didn't get much out of it, to be honest. I'd still recommend it if you've made it this far into the Language of Thorns, but on its own I wouldn't read it, and I'm giving When Water Sang Fire a C. Hey everyone, I just read The Language of Thorns by leighbardugo, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually really enjoyed it. Of all the series to have a short story collection that I actually like, I was not expecting it to be the Grishaverse. It's a collection of dairy fairy tales. I actually wrote dairy fairy tales. Okay, good job, brain. It's a collection of dark fairy tales and fables from the world of the Shadow and Bone books, riffing on classic stories from our own world like Beauty and the Beast and Hansel and Gretel. The pros? I really liked how these stories were set in the world that the main books had already established, but in a very gentle way. Familiar places like Ravka and Fjerda are mentioned, but in the same way real-world places would be mentioned in real-world fairy tales. They're just background elements, and I thought that aspect of the collection was really well done. I also really liked how all of these stories put a bit of a subversive twist on tales that the reader is probably already familiar with, such as the collection's take on Hansel and Gretel. And I really enjoyed how all of these stories don't shy away from the darker side of fairy tales. There are some horrific moments in this collection that you would not find in the modern Disney take on these kinds of fables, such as a fox begging for his life as he's being skinned alive. Fun. The cons? I don't really see the point of this collection. It's fun, but it doesn't really add anything to the Grishaverse, and in fact you could remove that connection and very little would actually change. It's just completely superfluous. The stories might revolve around a lot of different ideas, but a lot of them feature leading young women who mostly blur together. I liked a lot of them more than Alina Starkov, but there isn't much distinction between most of them. And if I had to pick a least favourite, I'd have to say it was the final story in the collection. It was just a bit too long, and felt like an obvious riff on Disney's Frozen, even though I'm pretty sure it's meant to be The Little Mermaid. I went into this book expecting to hate it, so I was pleasantly surprised at how it turned out. I found there was actually a lot to like about it. That said, I don't really know who I'd recommend it to. It's so tangential to the rest of the Grishaverse that I'd only suggest it to the most diehard fans, but if you're an enjoyer of twisted fairy tales and want something a little more modern, you could probably do worse. And I'm giving The Language of Thorns a B. Hey everyone, I just read Shadow and Bone by leighbardugo, and it was okay. I'm not really sure what all the fuss was about. It's a book about a world where a scar of darkness called the Unsea cuts the kingdom of Ravka in two, and the young woman who discovers she just might have the power to destroy it. The pros? The world building is a lot of fun. I like that it draws influence from Eastern Europe and Asia rather than Western Europe. I like that the time period is more Enlightenment than Middle Ages. The Unsea is a really cool idea. It's just a good time. I wish it and the politics of the various kingdoms had been given a bigger focus over the teen drama. The book was at its best when Alina, the lead, wasn't caught up in the court politics of the little palace, the opening set piece, and then the start of the third act. I really enjoyed those sections of the story. And in what I have to assume is a response to certain other popular young adult novels from the time of release, this book features an ancient wizard pushing himself onto a young woman, and I'm glad the story treats it for the creepy abuse of power that it is, rather than any sort of romance. The cons? This is just every young adult novel ever written. The setting is interesting, but the plot might as well be paint by numbers. There are no surprises here. So much of the book is spent on nothing but teen drama and training at the palace, and when the big second act twist does come, a lot of it feels out of nowhere despite being obvious from the very beginning. It's just nothing you haven't seen before. I really did not enjoy the ending. It felt so rushed and was such a cop-out. Very little is actually resolved by the final page. Very few of the main characters who are set up throughout the novel actually do anything by the end of it. It all just felt like an extended prologue that is unable to stand on its own merits. And the villain is just so boring. I don't think every young adult antagonist needs to be a fountain of nuance, but there's just nothing to this guy. He's just an obsessive creep who wants to take over the world. I can see the potential here for something great, but I really don't understand why it's taken off the way it has. It's not bad by any means, but it's nothing stand out either. I guess check it out if you're a fan of young adult fantasy or enjoyed the Netflix adaptation and haven't read it already, though I haven't actually watched it myself. Just be aware that aside from its setting, it's a pretty generic book overall, and I'm giving Shadow and Bone a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Tailor, a short story set during the events of Shadow and Bone, and I'm sure it was a useful writing exercise, but it didn't really add anything to the series, honestly. Mostly, it just made me wish that the trilogy had been told from multiple perspectives. It's a short story about Jenya's decision during the events of Shadow and Bone to support the faction that she does, which sets her on a path with dire consequences. The pros? As I mentioned, it was great to be out of Alina Starkov's head, if only for around 20 pages. It was a very welcome glimpse at what this trilogy could have been if it had featured multiple viewpoints. The story added a little nuance to Jenya's decision that in the main book felt like it was there because storytelling convention dictated that she must do what she does, so there's that, and it was interesting to get a little more first-hand context of Jenya's relationship with the Ravkan Queen, which was mostly relegated to the background in the main books. The cons? Even in this story that barely features Alina and doesn't feature Mal at all, the central conflict is still somehow about their dumb, stupid, awful, bad revolving door of a relationship, and I cannot stand it. It doesn't really add anything to the series. Everything presented here can be inferred from reading the main books, and while the nuance it gives is nice, it's not strictly speaking necessary. And the ending of the story just isn't effective because everybody who has read Shadow and Bone already knows that it happened, and everybody who hasn't read the book won't understand the context. It's a completely non-functional ending twist. It's not poorly written, I just don't think it adds anything to the series. Maybe give it a read if you're a super fan of the trilogy. It's freely available, so why not? But I got nothing out of it, and I'm giving The Tailor a D. Sorry. Hey everyone, I just read Siege and Storm by leighbardugo, and it was mid. Fight me. I know that I made the joke of I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards in the video for Shadow and Bone, but it's so applicable here I have to do it again. It's not like this book tried anything new, why should I? It's a book about a world torn in two by a scar of darkness expanding across the kingdom of Ravka, thanks to the schemes of the evil wizard who created it in the first place, and the one young woman on the run and considered a saint by the masses, who just might be able to destroy it and set things right. The pros? I said I wanted a bigger focus on politics in the first book, and I got my wish. There is much more attention given to that aspect of the world in this entry, and most of it was pretty good. I really enjoyed Nikolai as a character. He was fun, he was rakish, he was an actual person underneath all the bravado. He was a great addition to the cast. Even if I couldn't stand his role in the story as another part of the love square growing up around the lead character, I genuinely wish the book had just been about him instead. And I really enjoyed the climax. It was a bit of bloodthirsty fun until it became one of the worst things I've ever read. The cons? Have you read Shadow and Bone? Then congratulations, you've also read Siege and Storm. It is the exact same book, just told in reverse, and most of it is just worse. So much is just spent farting about in the little palace. All of the twists are obvious. Yet again, nothing is resolved. It ends on the most disingenuous cliffhanger I've ever seen, because you just know it's going to be instantly resolved in the third book. I really could not stand it. On that note, the pacing of this book is just awful. An absurd amount of stuff happens in the first 150 pages, but then the book just slows to an absolute crawl, and drags the story out to the climax. And worst of all, the narrator spends pretty much the entire thing without any agency. She's just present or captured. Most of the book is just other more interesting people doing other more interesting things around her. It was infuriating. And by far the worst aspect of this book is the teen drama, because it is just so contrived. Bad enough all the garbage love square stuff and the way Alina now seems open to being romanced by Mr. Sunset, so we can toss that aspect of praise from the first book out the window. The moment where Alina and Mel have their 100th for realsies this time falling out because she has a vision of Mr. Sunset over his shoulder and then stubbornly refuses to explain anything to him was just such sloppy writing. Yeah, I really did not enjoy this book. The first one wasn't bad, but it definitely had its problems, and they are all on display and exacerbated here because of how similar the two novels are in many ways. It's just another young adult fantasy novel, and if Shadow and Bone didn't click with you, then this one probably won't either. And overall, I wouldn't recommend it. And I'm giving Siege and Storm a D. Sorry, actually, at the time I'm recording this review, I've since read Divergent, and I honestly owe Siege and Storm an apology. I'm bumping it up to a C, but you're on thin ice. Hey everyone, I just read Ruin and Rising by leighbardugo, and oh, so that's how we're ending it. If I was invested in this story, I would be absolutely livid. It's a book about the kingdom of Ravka, divided by a scar of darkness and a civil war, and the young woman who is now the only one capable of not only healing the evil magic wrought on the world, but bringing peace to the kingdom overall. The pros? I liked the locations in this book. It was nice to get out of that stuffy old palace and see more of the world, like the caves and their mysterious ruins, along with the mountains. I wish there had been more unique settings like that across the trilogy. For better or worse, this book does bring the trilogy to a conclusive end. All the major conflicts are resolved by the final page, which is nice after 2 whole books of non-endings. And I really enjoyed Barbara's tragic backstory. It was an effective bit of storytelling that explained a lot about her character and the whole mythology of the setting overall. The cons? This book is just allergic to consequences. The cliffhanger from the previous book is just brushed aside 50 pages in, as I was expecting. Minor characters drop like flies, but the leads might as well be immortal. I just had no reason to be invested when I already knew how everything was going to end. Speaking of which, there is a twist in this book that was so laughably ridiculous and out of nowhere that I had to put the book down and walk away for a little while. It is so dumb. It is so contrived. It might actually be one of the worst twists I've ever encountered. It genuinely ruined the book, and I don't even care that much about the story as it is. And all the interesting stuff, the politics, the war, the magic, all of it takes a backseat to a never-ending slog of teen drama and love dodecahedrons that is still just the same as it was in the first book. Every single entry, Alina and Mel's relationship just resets to 0, and they have to get back together. I can't stand it. Especially given Mel is such a wet fart. Nikolai might be a dingus, but at least he's interesting. You know what? Maybe I do care about this story a little bit. I liked it more than the second book, and I wouldn't call it bad until, you know, the twist, but it still didn't do much for me. I really enjoyed the setting, inaccurate to Eastern Europe as it apparently is, but the story is just so generic, and then it just runs right off the edge of a cliff. I just couldn't get into it. I'd only recommend it if you enjoyed the first 2 books, but if you didn't like Siege and Storm, this one isn't going to redeem the trilogy for you in my opinion, and I'm giving Ruined and Rising a high C. Hey everyone, I just read 6 of Crows by leighbardugo, and you know what? It was pretty good. Finally, some decent food. It's a book about a band of young thieves called the Dregs hired to break into a prison called the Ice Court in order to recover the creator of a powerfully addictive drug capable of enhancing a mage's power at the behest of powerful political entities, but not everything is as it seems. The pros? The setting is greatly expanded from the Shadow and Bone trilogy. It is so nice to be out of Ravka and in the muck of Ketterdam and Theoda. The world building here is great. It feels much more mature and much less young adulty than the previous books too. It was also a huge breath of fresh air to have more than one point of view character. The narrators are all really interesting people with their own lives, and their own issues, and their own loyalties, and best of all, when they did come to blows with each other, it rarely ever felt contrived. And the story spins a pretty good yarn. There are a couple of dud moments, but there are also a lot of great set pieces and fun twists, especially toward the end. It does still end on a bit of a cliffhanger, but it feels earned this time around. It's a real page turner. The cons? I probably disliked Matthias the most out of the narrators, not because he wasn't an interesting character. I think a witch hunter grudgingly falling for a witch is a pretty good setup for a person, but he is such a little edgelord, and his inner turmoil is resolved in the dumbest way at the end. It just felt too much like the sort of thing that played the Shadow and Bone trilogy for me to really get invested in. There's maybe a little too much going on in this book. It does a pretty good job of juggling all of its plot threads and bringing them to a satisfying conclusion, information, but even so, I was a little lost on a couple of things by the end. And since this book is set after the events of the Shadow and Bone trilogy, there are a bunch of references to what happened in those books, and most of the time I didn't mind them, but there were one or two that just stretched the suspension of disbelief. It felt like they were there more for the sake of the reference than because it made sense for the story, but whatever, it's a nitpick. This book was a pleasant surprise, I really enjoyed it. I'd easily recommend it over the entire Shadow and Bone trilogy, and honestly suggest you start with it if you're a fan of young adult fantasy, or if the setting sounds interesting to you, because it is just a better book in general, and I'm giving Six of Crows an A. Hey everyone, I just read Crooked Kingdom by Leighbardugo, and it was pretty great honestly. You never see enough duets in fiction these days, it's always trilogies or something even longer, and it's nice to wrap things up quick for a change. It's a book about a group of young thieves called the Crows who find themselves in the company of the only man capable of producing a powerful magical drug, and the various factions looking to take it for themselves by any means necessary. The Pros. There were a lot of great stories going on in this book, but the standout for me had to be the game being played between Kaz and the two main villains, Jan van Eck and Pekka Rollins, for control of the magical drug. The final confrontation between Kaz and Rollins was just, ooh, chef's kiss. I really enjoyed how this book took great care to build up a house of cards of plot threads and Chekhov's guns, only to revel in smashing the whole thing down during the story's climax. It was wonderfully paced, wonderfully constructed, and there were actual consequences to some of the actions taken too. And it was great to have Sturmhound back for another book, even if I could mostly do without his entourage. He wasn't just a glorified cameo, and I really enjoyed how none of the point of view characters ever put together his true identity, that it was a secret between him and the readers of the original trilogy. The cons. One of my biggest writing pet peeves is when villains barge their way into the plot right at the very end of a story and refuse to leave. And there is a minor villain who does that here. It's definitely not the most annoying example that I've encountered, but she's such a flat, boring character. There was definitely a way Inej could have completed her character arc without introducing such a cardboard cutout of a mini-boss. Speaking of which, Inej's stint as a damsel in distress at the beginning of the novel was probably the weakest part of the story in my opinion. It was kind of unavoidable given it was set up in the cliffhanger from Six of Crows, but it dragged the book along like a ball and chain until its resolution early on. I couldn't stand it. And there was a slight return to the kind of dumb teen drama that I really didn't like from the Shadow and Bone trilogy with some of the stuff that happened in Jesper and Wyland's plot, but given theirs was only one of several storylines running through the book, it wasn't really a huge deal here. It's just a nitpick. This book was great. I really enjoyed it. I'm actually a little sad to be done with these characters in this part of the setting. There's a bit too much context needed from Six of Crows for me to suggest reading it on its own, though it does tell a complete story in my opinion, but I definitely recommend the duet overall if you're a fan of young adult fantasy, or if you felt a little let down by the Shadow and Bone trilogy. And I'm giving The Crooked Kingdom an A. Hey everyone, I just read King of Scars by Leighbardugo, and I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. This feels like going back to a project you started when you were inexperienced and trying to make it work now that you know what you're doing, and it just did not click a lot of the time. It's a book about Nikolai Lantsov, the King of Ravka, who has the unfortunate habit of turning into a demon every now and then, and his attempts to undo his curse while keeping the kingdom from collapsing a few short years after the Civil War, depicted in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. The pros. This may not come as much of a surprise, but the parts of this book that follow on directly from the Six of Crows duet, especially Nina's plotline in Fjorda, were really good. They were way more interesting than Nikolai's Spirit Quest in my opinion. This book attempts to bridge the more traditionally fantastical elements from the Shadow and Bone trilogy with the more grounded and realistic world of the Six of Crows duet in some interesting ways, such as with the Saints. And while I don't think all of it worked, I do really like the effort. And while I didn't really like how Nikolai spent a lot of the book farting about in the Shadowfold with Zoya, I did still enjoy his point of view chapters. He was a fun leading man. The cons. That said, the cast of narrators here just doesn't compare to Kaz and the Crows. They're not bad, but a lot of them are returning characters from the Shadow and Bone trilogy who are held back by the rotten foundation those books create for their characterization. Although this book and its sequel do try to rectify that, overall though, they're just not as engaging. The worst would have to be Isaac though, in my opinion. He wasn't a bad character in concept, but whatever interesting ramifications his plot thread might have had are cut short and neatly swept under the rug by the end of the book. It felt like he was just there to serve a purpose rather than be an interesting character, and his chapters mostly came across as filler to me. And there is a pretty big twist at the end of this book that I really did not like. It just felt like the author attempting to fix things about her earlier works that she isn't happy with, and I really wish she'd just let it stay as is. I'm so torn on this book. I really wish I could like it more because there are points that soar as high as the Six of Crows duet, but overall it's wearing the Shadow and Bone trilogy like a set of concrete shoes, and it just dragged the whole thing down for me. If you're a fan of Nikolai from the original trilogy, or the Six of Crows duet, I'd still recommend it because there is stuff to like. Just be aware there's a lot of baggage from earlier books holding it back, and I'm giving King of Scars a B. Hey everyone, I just read Rule of Wolves by leighbardugo, and I don't use this comparison lightly, but that felt a lot like Season 8 of Game of Thrones to me. It's been a while since I've read a series that fumbled its ending quite so hard. It's a book about the kingdom of Ravka, which finds itself threatened on all sides by its neighbours Fjorda and Shuhan, and the suddenly returned and rapidly expanding Scar of Darkness, and its king, Nikolai Lantsov, trying to hold things together at all costs. The pros? Much like with King of Scars, Nina and Hannah's plots were the most engaging parts of the book in my opinion. They're just much more interesting characters doing much more interesting things than the vast majority of the cast for most of the novel. And on that note, it was great to have the crows back for a little while too. This book probably has the biggest focus on world politics of the entire franchise, and it was great. I really enjoyed the twists and turns of the war, and its culmination in the climactic battle was actually fantastic. It was a great rollercoaster ride, especially with its mix of fantasy and industrial warfare. And the book does take some pretty big risks in killing off certain characters and changing certain others. I don't think they all worked, and I have a bit to say about that in the cons, but I do admire that the author took them at all, so there's that. The cons? I really did not like much about the ending. It does bring the story started way back in Shadow and Bone to a conclusion, but as I mentioned at the start of this review, it has major Season 8 of Game of Thrones vibes. About the only part of it I did like was where Nina and Hannah ended up. The rest of it was crap. I also really did not like how much plot from the Shadow and Bone trilogy gets dragged back up into the spotlight here. That story had a perfectly functional ending. I hate how this book kept bringing parts of it back without actually doing anything interesting with them. And by the final page, some of them aren't even resolved. Just let it go. And I feel like Nikolai kind of gets sidelined in his own story. He still does a lot, still has a full character arc, but he doesn't feel like the protagonist compared to someone like Zoya, and I feel like he got done a bit dirty, honestly. What a wild ride this book was. There's a lot of it I really liked, and a lot of it I really didn't, and overall I wanted to enjoy it more than I did. Because this is the last book in the series at the time of writing, I can't really recommend it if you're not already a fan. There's just too much context from too many different series needed to go into this one blind. But if you are caught up on everything, if King of Scars didn't do anything for you, I don't think this book is going to be worth it. And I'm giving Rule of Wolves a C. It was actually closing in on an A right up until the ending. Sorry. Hey everyone, I just read The Lives of Saints by leighbardugo, with illustrations by Daniel Zollinger, and it just felt like a soulless cash grab. Who is this for? What purpose does it serve? It's an illustrated collection of very short stories about how the various saints of the Grishaverse were sanctified over the years. The pros? The illustrations are good, they're nice to look at, and they add at least something to get invested in with these stories. It was actually interesting to get some backstory on the saints that have been mentioned in passing throughout the series, at least from a world building standpoint. It did actually really help in fleshing out the setting, and if I absolutely had to pick a favourite, it would have to be Ilya in Chains, partly because it's an example of how the saints in this setting aren't necessarily good or nice people, but it also shows how the truth as revealed in the Shadow and Bone trilogy has been skewed over time into the story as it is presented here. The cons? It just feels so bare, so rough, like a first draft written over the course of a week just to get it out the door. There are a couple of moments where the prose reaches the level of Bardugo's usual present day quality, but for the most part it just wasn't there. None of the saints feel like actual characters. They all blend together aside from the ones already well known from the series. It feels more like actual real life stories about saints that are heavily sanitized and stripped of character character and atmosphere, and realistic as that might be, it does not make for very engaging stories. And all of the stories are so short, there's no time to get invested in any of them. By the time you start to get a feel for what's going on, they're already over. There is nothing to this collection. There are over 20 stories, but they are also short and perfunctory. There's barely any character, there's barely any atmosphere, there's barely any conflict. It's the literary equivalent of eating cardboard. I don't think there's even enough material here for me to review the shorts individually when I come to the inevitable compilation video. It would just be me praising the illustrations for every single one and struggling for something else good to say about them. If you're obsessed with the Grishaverse, there might be something here for you, but if you're looking for an actual story, or even a collection of stories, you're better off looking elsewhere. It's too simple for most mature readers to get much out of, and it's too macabre for me to really consider it suitable for younger readers. And I'm giving The Lives of Saints an F. And since we're here, why not one more for the road? Hey everyone, I just read The Grishaverse by leighbardugo, and it was a real roller coaster of quality. What an absolutely wild ride. It's a series about a rapidly industrializing world still shackled to its magical mythical past, and the way the two collide in crazy ways, be it a scar of darkness cutting a country in half, wrought by a timeless wizard that must be traversed by flying ships, or a powerful drug able to amplify a mage's abilities to the point of turning them into super weapons that starts an arm race between the neighbouring countries of the region. The pros? I love the setting. It's a great mix of traditional fantasy and steampunk, influenced by parts of Europe and Asia, usually left unrepresented in a lot of Western fiction. The closest thing I can really compare it to is the world of the Dishonored games. It was great fun. The Six of Crows duet was easily the best part of the series for me. It's a great story with a great cast of characters, and I was shocked not only at how much of an improvement it was over the Shadow and Bone trilogy, but how invested I found myself in the books. And the short fiction was surprisingly good, at least the stories collected in the Language of Thorns. I was not expecting a bunch of in-universe fairy tales to be so fun to read. The cons? The Shadow and Bone trilogy is like a ball and chain around this setting's leg. I appreciate that the Six of Crows duet wouldn't exist without it, but the story was just bog-standard young adult fantasy, the characters were insufferable, and later books just keep dredging up perfectly resolved plot threads from this early part of the series. I just want it to be over with already. This is a con that gets less prevalent as the series goes on, but it never quite goes away, and that is its reliance on contrived teen drama in order to create needless conflict. I hate this kind of thing, especially since the way it's resolved is usually just as forced. And I don't know if the author intends to continue the story, but if this is where the series is to end, then I think it really did not stick the landing. Rule of Wolves left a very bitter taste in my mouth regarding the Grishaverse overall. This series has a lot of ups and downs. There are some great moments that I'm really glad I got to experience, and there are some moments that made me collapse into a black hole of cringe, but overall I'm glad I read them, and I'm still invested enough to maybe check out wherever the story goes next, if only in the hopes that it might finally escape the shackles of its past. It's kind of hard to recommend as a whole. I think you're probably better off checking out whatever individual parts of it appeals to you the most. The Shadow and Bone trilogy if you're looking for some comfy if frustrating young adult fantasy, the Six of Crows duet if you're looking for a low fantasy heist that is a little more complex and a little more mature, the King of Scars duet if you're looking for some blend of the two that skews closer to epic fantasy, and the short fiction if you're looking for some dark fairy tales. You can read the Shadow and Bone trilogy and the Six of Crows duet without really needing to read the other, and the short fiction is mostly standalone, but the King of Scars duet definitely requires some context from earlier entries to fully get, so just keep that in mind. And after all that, I'm giving the Grishaverse a B. And that's it, every Grishaverse story reviewed, almost, and here they are all ranked. I'm glad someone suggested this series because there is a lot to like about it despite my problems with most of the books. Speaking of which, I'm always looking for more reading suggestions, so if there's something you'd like me to check out, post it down in the comments below. The pile of suggestions is probably big enough to run me well into next year at this point, but I promise I'll get around to them eventually. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video and want to see more, please like, subscribe, and share the video around. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.